We were not prepared for a pandemic, even though we had unlimited resources and could have absolutely been prepared.
In my last video, I addressed the ludicrous idea that if we just nationalized all of healthcare, we would eliminate perverse incentives entailed in our current system. Today, I want to talk about some of the hazards associated with government action of this sort, and provide some specific examples. I'll link my last video in the description box below, just in case you haven't watched it, but I'll also quickly sum up the major points that are relevant to this video, so you don't have to watch it if you don't feel like it. The main argument of that video was that having the government produce something or provide a service, which it would presumably do outside of the profit motive. Government programs and state-run companies don't exist to make money, and if they do, profits usually don't go to shareholders. Doesn't change the fact that the people within these institutions face incentives that put their own interests at odds with the general public. People on the left oftentimes complain about the defense industry, and how defense contractors have used their employment of Americans to their political advantage.
And we have jobs tied to the military-industrial complex in all 50 states. So in this country, our welfare is warfare.
That's certainly true, and it is, and would be even more true if the government got further involved in the healthcare industry. Over the course of this pandemic, the government has purchased hundreds of millions of vaccines from the pharmaceutical companies and given them to Americans free at the point of service. It has also used the Defense Production Act to produce various pieces of equipment deemed necessary to combat the virus. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, Trump employed a range of DPA powers. After initially hesitating, he ordered General Motors to produce ventilators and 3M to produce N95 masks for the federal government. Responding to concerns about the supply of meat following several plant closures, Trump used DPA authority to ensure that meat processing plants remain open by declaring them critical infrastructure. In one of his first official acts as president, Biden signed an executive order directing his administration to identify shortfalls in the supply of materials needed for the pandemic response and use the DPA to address them, if necessary. Since then, the Biden administration has used the DPA to spur vaccine production by helping manufacturers secure the equipment and components needed to make doses. It has also used the law to expand access to testing, which isn't working out too well, might I add. In December 2021, the administration announced plans to distribute 500 million COVID-19 tests, leveraging the DPA to speed up production in response to the fast-spreading Omicron variant of the coronavirus. For those of you who don't know, the Defense Production Act was a law originally enacted during the Truman administration at the start of the Korean War. There are three major provisions to the DPA, the first and third of which we'll be looking at today. The first one allows the federal government to distribute what are called rated orders to private business, which these businesses must prioritize over other work as much as possible. The third provision authorizes federal resource appropriation to industries deemed critical infrastructure with the purpose of expanding productive capacity and supply of critical goods. An example of this was when Biden brokered a deal with Merck and Johnson & Johnson under the authority of the DPA to convert some of their facilities to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines. As an aside, I do think it's funny watching people who rightfully complain about the expansion of executive authority after 9/11 demand that the sitting president use a 71-year-old wartime law to force private business to do what they want.
So the one monoclonal antibody treatment that works, there's a shortage. Well, this is where you blame Biden, because Biden should have invoked the Defense Production Act to massively increase the supply of all the different antibody treatments, and then it would always be available.
But that's a different topic for a different day. Did the invocation of the DPA work in this instance? From the standpoint of vaccine production, it certainly did. American pharmaceutical companies have been able to produce far more vaccines at a faster rate than they probably otherwise would have. Of course, there are costs to this policy. For starters, there are shortages of certain medications for treatments of thyroid conditions and breast cancer that are in part due to this change in production. Making more of one thing usually means making less of another. There's nothing particularly unique to the government or the Defense Production Act in that respect, as that would happen in the free market as well. There would, at the very least, be lag time as companies responded to changes in demand. I can see the argument that producing more COVID-19 vaccines at the expense of more niche medications is a worthwhile trade-off from a public policy perspective, but that's not really what I'm concerned about. I'm thinking much more about what happened when the DPA was used to make ventilators. Early on in the pandemic, a lot of people were concerned that we'd run short on the breathing machines due to the fact that COVID-19 is primarily a disease that infects the lungs. In response to this fear, President Trump used the Defense Production Act to order Ford and GM to produce ventilators. And these efforts worked. According to the Washington Post, General Electric, Philips, and other manufacturers' efforts have delivered more than 94,000 of them to the stockpile. This article was written in August of 2020, so that number has only risen since. And General Motors plans to soon hand over its business to a counterpart. President Trump declared it a triumph, stating that the United States had become the king of ventilators. What were the consequences of this? Well, needless to say, the production shift to producing ventilators, which we did appear to be short on at the time Trump invoked the DPA, took several months. Companies had to train new workers on new machines and processes on how to build them. They had to reorient supply chains and make sure that their new products were actually functional. Over the course of this transition time period, the medical community became split on the use of ventilators for treating patients with severe symptoms associated with COVID-19. Mechanical ventilation of the sort provided by these machines is highly invasive. It involves shoving a tube down your throat. It's usually seen as a last resort. Early on in the pandemic, about half of patients sick enough to go on ventilators ended up dying. Back in April of 2020, when the pandemic was relatively new in the United States, Jamie Ducharme at Time magazine interviewed several doctors who expressed skepticism of ventilator use. Ducharme wrote, "Few doctors are saying COVID-19 patients should never be ventilated, but there is a growing subset that thinks it's happening too quickly." Dr. Nicholas Hill, Chief of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine at Tufts Medical Center in Boston, and past president of the American Thoracic Society, says he's avoiding mechanical ventilation when he can, and finding success with some non-invasive options like flipping patients onto their stomachs, which can trigger better blood flow to the lungs. He says some doctors are intubating early because they fear that less intensive forms of ventilation, like high-flow nasal oxygen, can aerosolize the virus, putting healthcare workers at risk of getting sick. This is more theoretical fear than a real fear, Hill says, since there's no strong evidence that COVID-19 spreads this way. I certainly can't speak to the efficacy of ventilation in terms of treating patients with severe symptoms. I'm not a doctor nor a medical professional of any kind, and this is not medical advice in any way, shape, or form. If you do get sick, consult an actual medical professional to figure out what you need to do. What I do know is that by the time a lot of these manufacturers actually got around to cranking out ventilators, a lot of medical professionals were no longer concerned about a shortage. In fact, by the time ventilators started rolling off assembly lines, there was a glut. As Faiz Siddiqui wrote in the Washington Post back in August of 2020, now, unexpectedly, the vast majority of ventilators are going unused. The Department of Health and Human Services said it had handed out 15,057 ventilators by Friday, and there were 95,713 ventilators in the federal stockpile. Of those, 94,352 came from contracts signed since the beginning of the pandemic. Turns out, we made a few too many ventilators. So, who is to blame for this? Was it President Trump who issued the order? I'm not sure that's fair. When he invoked the DPA, doctors were clamoring for them. So, are they to blame? I'm not sure that's fair either. There were authoritative estimates conducted by, from what I can tell, credible sources. Are those sources to blame? I honestly don't know. Maybe their methodologies were all out of sorts. But honestly, it seems like an entirely reasonable mistake to make. There was this sudden emergence of a highly contagious respiratory virus that could get people very sick. It seems like the sort of thing we would need a lot of ventilators for, but it turns out we didn't need as many as we thought. In one sense, this is a systemic failure of government-coordinated action. We heard a lot of people on the left gloat about how capitalism failed to provide us with necessary goods to prepare for the pandemic.
Why in the world were we unprepared? We had companies that can produce masks and gloves and ventilators and all of that, but they didn't do it. And I know why. I'm an economist. What I study, it isn't profitable. No company wants to produce masks by the millions, store them in warehouses around the country where the population is concentrated, make sure that they are clean, make sure that they don't deteriorate, replace those that do, watch the whole thing. And then you never know when the next virus will be. Will you have to sit on all of this for 2 years, for 6 years, or for 20 years? So it's not profitable. It's not a rational, capitalist, profit-driven calculation to make. So the companies didn't, and we didn't have the ventilators, the gloves, the masks, and all the rest.
Of course, we don't know what we're going to need for a future pandemic, because, by definition, we don't know what sort of disease will be pandemic and how the disease will affect people. And contrary to what you may have heard, we don't have unlimited resources.
We were not prepared for a pandemic, even though we had unlimited resources and could have absolutely been prepared. Having a for-profit privatized healthcare model put us in a terrible position to respond adequately to the coronavirus pandemic.
So we can't just stockpile everything we could possibly need for any potential set of circumstances. This is a point my friend Sean over the channel Actual Justice Warrior made over a year ago.
We did not know whether or not we were going to need ventilators in the future. That was going to be the desperately needed thing for the pandemic. Let's say we had all the ventilators that we could have possibly ever imagined stockpiled across the country for a respiratory-related pandemic, and all of a sudden the pandemic came out, and it turns out we needed a bunch of dialysis machines because the thing that the pandemic actually targeted was the kidneys. Now let's say, oh, well, we should have all the ventilators and all the dialysis machines, and then it turns out we need something else completely different. The fact of the matter is, no person, country, nation, or whatever is ever going to be prepared enough for a situation like this. All you can do is have the potential productive capacity to produce these things in a pinch in order to meet that demand.
If socialists like Richard Wolff are going to insist that our lack of PPE at the beginning of the pandemic is a failure of capitalism, is he going to concede that the government ordering businesses to produce way more of a good than is actually needed is a failure of central planning? Probably not. I should also note that this use of the Defense Production Act has contributed to inflation, particularly in the automobile sector. You see, when you order some of the largest vehicle manufacturing plants in the country to start producing ventilators, that means that they have to stop producing vehicles, at least in the short run. That means there are fewer cars for people to buy, which means that unless demand goes down along with supply, which it didn't, you'll have the same amount of people trying to purchase fewer vehicles, which means that prices will go up. But of course, according to some people, corporate greed is the cause of inflation.
Corporate greed created a supply chain crisis. Corporate greed led BNSF to underpay their workers, causing their own internal labor shortage. Rather than solving that self-created crisis by lifting pay, corporate greed led BNSF to shift that entire burden onto their existing workers. And then, federal judge comes in to point to the supply chain crisis caused by corporate greed in the beginning in order to cut off the one source of power that those workers have to fight back. What a system, folks.
Because apparently corporate greed didn't exist till last year, when high inflation started. I've railed against government planning before in terms of results, and surely in the future I'll do it again. That's not what I want to focus on here, though. I want to talk more specifically about the moral hazard here. What I want to focus on here is how, when it comes to government, bad ideas have a bad habit of sticking around. We've overproduced ventilators to the point where we're literally giving them away for free. And pretty much all of our PPE production has adapted to the point where it is no longer hard to come by. And yet, there's still federal money being pumped into companies producing PPE, despite the fact that it's pretty hard to justify at this point. $10 billion was appropriated to be used under the Defense Production Act when President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act. As the trade attorney and economist Scott Lincicome pointed out, not all of that money allocated from the Defense Production Act over the course of this pandemic has gone to things actually pertaining to preventing the spread of COVID-19. As Lincicome writes, according to a July 2020 Congressional Research Service report, the Department of Defense invoked the DPA to give hundreds of millions of dollars, appropriated under the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economy Security Act to fight COVID-19, to politically connected industries, shipbuilding, semiconductors, space-based defense, aviation, microelectronics, rare earth mining, etc., that are at best tangentially related to the pandemic. The report adds that these and other COVID-19 actions lack transparency and accountability, led to the reassignment of one official, and were opposed by several House committees because they were not, as Congress intended, reserved for health and medical measures. We don't have a full report on how the $10 billion devoted to the Defense Production Act and the American Rescue Plan Act have been spent. I'm not sure all of it has been spent as of now, but I have a feeling that the exact same thing is going to happen. The reason I'm so confident in this is because there's very little incentive for politicians who are administering the money to do so in a way that is actually serviceable to the general public. Rather, they're much more likely to act in a way that's politically, or even financially, advantageous to themselves, even if the public doesn't need the things that the money is going towards producing, like ventilators. Now let's compare this incentive structure to that facing private businesses. Early on in the pandemic, I visited a number of industrial facilities for work, and I saw various measures they took to avoid the spread. They all placed an emphasis on preventing the spread via contact surfaces, My favorite was one facility that had these tissue paper dispensers at every single door that you were supposed to hold while touching the door handle so that you didn't make direct contact with it. My own employer hired outside contractors to disinfect every regularly touched surface multiple times a day. We have since learned that you're very unlikely to get COVID-19 via surface spread. All of these facilities have since dropped these efforts in response. So what's the difference here? Well, as we've seen, both private industry and government can make mistakes and spend resources in ways that are pretty unnecessary. The difference is, because of the evil profit motive, private industry has every reason to stop doing it when they realize it's not worth it. They don't want to waste money on things that are not pertinent to their basic objectives. The government, on the other hand, has no incentive not to spend money on things that we don't really need, and they have very strong incentives to spend them in ways that are advantageous to them personally. No, Anna, we do not have unlimited resources.
Even though we had unlimited resources and could have absolutely been prepared.
Even in these times of abundance, we can only produce so many goods and services. Private industry economizes these resources because these resources belong to them, and they want to get the most out of them. Government, on the other hand, does not economize resources because the resources they use belong to someone else, you. And there's very little penalty for using them ineffectively, and sometimes they're even rewarded for doing so. Getting rid of the profit motive does not get rid of perverse incentives.